Today we are going to discuss about working capital, and further we are also going to discuss its various approaches in detail. Now let us first understand the basic meaning of working capital. See, in an organization it is very important that the production process goes on smoothly, right? So in order to achieve this, the organization always keeps, or it is very important that the current assets are in excess of current liability. Now when I say current assets, it includes basically the cash that is with us, okay? Then also it includes the cash which is at bank also. Then there is bills receivable, okay? Then sundry debtors. Debtors are basically those parties whom who are supposed to pay us in future, okay? So it is very important that these current assets are in excess of current liability, right? Current liability includes various loans that we have to pay to the financiers, then also the suppliers whom we have to pay certain amount. So it is important that there is an excess of the current assets over current liability, okay? Then only we'll be able to meet our future needs. So this is what exactly current working capital is, right? But in working capital also there are two types, okay? The gross working capital. When we talk specifically about gross working capital, it includes only the current assets part, right? That is cash, stock, debtors and all. But when we talk about net working capital, it is the difference between current assets and current liabilities, like I said, okay? So the formula for this is net working capital equals current assets minus current liabilities. See, if let's say I have debtors worth 1 lakh, okay, and creditors worth rupees 60,000. What does this mean? That I will have to pay 60,000 in future, okay, into the creditors, and what I will remain with 40,000, okay, which will remain with me. So this is net working capital which will help me in running my operations smoothly. For example, in future, let's say I have want to buy certain stock, then this 40,000 will be used for that. And also if I have to pay to some other creditors, new creditors, then this will be utilized in that, okay? So this is the concept of working capital. Now let us discuss the various approaches of working capital management. See, working capital management particularly is planning, organizing, directing, controlling the working capital needs of the organization, right? Now, what are its approaches? The first one is the conservative approach. See, conservative approach basically means that we have to maintain a higher level of working capital, okay? We have to keep the current assets as much as we can, okay, so as to reduce any future risks, okay? So long term financing sources are used to finance this permanent working capital. Now permanent working capital is basically that minimum amount of current assets that is required at all times to ensure a minimum level of business operations, okay? See, for example, let's say my organization has decided that at all the times we will keep at least 1 lakh rupees with us, okay? That is cash in hand, okay? All the time this is required, okay? And then we will also be keeping certain amount as the temporary working capital. See, when we have to finance, okay, this working capital, permanent working capital, we will be taking the route of long term financing. We all know what is long term financing, okay? That is the route of raising money, okay, through long term sources like long bank loans, okay? Then our debentures, everything which is a long term, okay? We will finance our permanent working capital through this long term financing. And also a part of temporary working capital, which is additional working capital required from time to time over and above the permanent capital. So just remember, this conservative approach basically focuses on raising the permanent working capital, that is the capital which we require every time to be financed from long term financing, okay, which is considered safe, and part of temporary working capital, okay, which is over and above the permanent capital to be financed from long term financing, okay. And short term financing is used to finance part of temporary working capital, okay. So temporary working capital is also financed partly from short term financing, okay. Now the other one is aggressive approach. Aggressive approach basically focuses on, see here, the portion of permanent working capital is financed by long term financial sources, okay. Portion of permanent working capital, right, not all working capital, okay. See, portion of working capital, not all working capital, okay. So here basically portion of working capital is financed, permanent working capital is financed from the long term financial sources, and entire temporary, okay, entire temporary working capital from short term sources, and partly the portion which remained of working long term permanent working capital through short term financing, okay. So this is basically a riskier approach, because here basically the permanent working capital is being financed partly from the short term financing and partly from the long term financing. Now the last one is the hedging or matching approach. This is considered to be the best approach, because here in this approach the entire permanent working capital is financed by long term financing, okay, which is appropriate, which is considered appropriate, okay. It is less risky. And entire temporary working capital by short term financing, okay. So what did we understand today? We basically understood the concept of working capital, which is nothing but the difference between the current assets and current liabilities. It is always considered that current assets should be more than the current liabilities, because when the current assets are more, we have idle cash, okay, we have extra money with us, and we can use that in future for all our operational needs, right. Then we talked about net working capital and gross working capital. Gross working capital is basically only the current assets part, whereas net working capital is the difference between current assets and current liabilities, okay. Then we further talked about the working capital management approaches. The first one being the conservative approach. Herein basically long term financing sources are used to finance permanent working capital and part of temporary working capital, and part of other temporary working capital is financed by short term financing sources also, right. Then we further talked about aggressive approach. Here basically the portion of permanent working capital is financed by long term financial sources, and portion of permanent working capital is financed by short term short term financing also, whereas temporary working capital is financed entirely from long term financial sources, right. Then we further talked about hedging or matching approach. It is the best approach, because in this entire permanent working capital is financed by long term financing, and entire temporary working capital is financed by short term financing. Now let us practice some important questions. Gross working capital includes a long-term debt, current liabilities, current assets, none of the above. See, we discussed that gross working capital is just other name of current assets. So the correct answer for this would be current assets. Now the next question is, in aggressive approach of working capital management, the temporary working capital is financed through long-term financing, short-term financing, current assets, none of the above. See, we discussed that in aggressive approach, the portion of permanent working capital is financed from long term financing, okay, and the entire temporary working capital is financed from long term So long-term financial sources. So the correct answer for this would be long-term financing. That is option A. So this was all for today. Thank you so much for your time.